In recent months, the debate surrounding tariffs has once again captured the spotlight of American economic policy discussions, driven by differing approaches from key political figures. On one side, we have U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen strongly cautioning against the rising calls for broad, untargeted tariffs, highlighting the damaging impacts such policies would have on both American households and businesses. On the other, we have former President Donald Trump, who is doubling down on his protectionist economic agenda, heralding tariffs as central to America's strategy to restore its economic independence and global positioning. Janet Yellen's stark warnings come amid the backdrop of Donald Trump's return to the political scene. As the Republican presidential candidate, Trump has consistently pushed tariffs as his policy tool of choice, claiming they would help to raise revenues for the U.S. and reduce its long-standing trade deficits. This bold protectionist stance, however, directly conflicts with the arguments laid out by most mainstream economists and Yellen herself, who clearly see such sweeping and untargeted tariffs as ineffective and damaging to both the short-term and long-term stability of the U.S. economy. So, let's break this issue down. What's really at stake here? How would Trump's tariff agenda affect the global trade landscape and, more importantly, the American economy? And are Yellen's warnings about the potential economic fallout justified? Through this in-depth analysis, we will dissect these questions, drawing on the latest data, broader economic trends, and real-world examples. Tariffs, at their core, are a means of imposing taxes on imported goods. The rationale behind this is simple. By taxing foreign products, governments make them comparatively more expensive than domestic products, theoretically encouraging consumers to buy locally instead. On the surface, this sounds appealing, especially in a world where globalization has resulted in significant trade imbalances, with some countries, most notably China, seen as benefiting disproportionately at the expense of others, including the United States. Historically, the U.S. has leaned on tariffs as a significant part of its trade policy, dating back to the high tariffs imposed in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. The results, however, were damaging. During the 1930s, as countries retaliated by raising their own tariffs in response, the global economy was thrown into a tailspin, deepening the severity of the Great Depression. More recently, in 2018 to 2019, President Donald Trump revived the idea of large-scale tariffs in his trade war with China. Tariffs of up to 25% were imposed on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports, with China retaliating in kind. Fast forward to today, we've seen many of these tariffs remaining in place under the Biden administration, prompting ongoing economic tensions between the two largest economies in the world. From a broader historical context, one key takeaway is that while tariffs can sometimes be useful in protecting nascent industries or addressing specific imbalances, when used universally and indiscriminately, they tend to do more harm than good. This isn't just a theoretical argument. It's backed up by both historical precedent and recent data. Janet Yellen, as a seasoned economist and current U.S. Treasury Secretary, is no stranger to the economic complexities of tariffs and trade policies. In her warnings to the Council on Foreign Relations, Yellen raised concerns that blanket tariffs would ultimately hurt American households first and foremost. Why? For one, tariffs operate as a tax. When the U.S. imposes a tariff on imported goods, prices rise, and American consumers end up paying more for those goods. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, for instance, estimated that U.S. tariffs imposed as part of the Trump administration's trade wars cost the average U.S. household nearly $1,300 per year by 2019. Rather than protecting American workers and industries, indiscriminate tariffs only succeeded in constraining supply chains, raising prices, and depressing household consumption growth. Yellen's verbal defense of a more nuance-driven and targeted approach aims to avoid precisely this consumer burden. Moreover, Yellen's warning refers to a more critical issue, namely, the need for international cooperation to tackle the multifaceted nature of modern economic and geopolitical challenges, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. According to Yellen, attempting to wall the U.S. off from the world, by imposing tariffs even on allies, would weaken America's standing on the global stage. It would also reduce its ability to influence major macroeconomic issues, from global energy security to combating economic distortions caused by major players like China. Despite the clear warnings, Trump has once again embraced tariffs as a core part of his economic platform, treating them as a way to demonstrate his muscular, America First agenda. He sees tariffs as a way to boost revenue, reduce trade deficits, and force other countries, particularly China, but allies too, to rethink their own trade dependence on the U.S. Trump's recent proposal for a 10% across-the-board import tariff would, in his estimation, raise billions of dollars. However, mainstream economists argue that such policies are effectively a tax on U.S. companies and consumers embedded within global supply chains. It might be politically popular to promise revenue from tariffs, but much of that wealth would simply be extracted from U.S. pockets. One of the most infamous side effects of tariffs, as highlighted by Yellen, is their inflationary impact. In today's post-pandemic era, where global supply chains are still recovering and inflation remains a lingering concern, adding another layer of price pressure through tariffs may aggravate an already fragile situation. Let's think about this logically. When tariffs are applied, goods become more expensive. If these goods form part of the supply chain, whether electronics, machinery, textiles, or essential components, this price pressure works its way down to consumers. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, found that the tariffs imposed during Trump's trade war caused firms to raise prices, leading to lower real wages for American workers. This dynamic is particularly concerning at a time when the Federal Reserve has worked aggressively to contain inflation. The latest inflationary data, as of September 2024, shows the U.S. inflation rate standing at 3.7%, down from its peak of over 9% in June 2022. This reduction is the result of painstaking interest rate hikes by the Fed, which have already led to increases in living costs, borrowing costs, mortgage rates, and a potential reduction in consumer spending. Imagine adding new tariffs to this equation. Already stretched household budgets would become even tighter. The inflationary consequences of Trump's proposed 10% across-the-board import tariff could undermine the hard-won gains made in combating inflation. More recently, the world has been witnessing the reshuffling of global trade due to supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic, geopolitical conflicts, and shifting strategic alliances. For instance, the nearshoring trend, where companies are reducing their dependency on China by relocating their manufacturing hubs to regions like Mexico or Southeast Asia, reflects businesses' response to these price pressures. While such relocations provide opportunities, they're not immediate and cannot easily offset the short to medium-term disruptions triggered by broad tariffs. Worsening supply chain imbalances would hamper the competitiveness of U.S. businesses even further. As seen during the trade tensions with China, businesses often adjusted by passing the costs onto American consumers, but they also lost due to inefficiencies. Ultimately, the core argument from Yellen, and one that most economists back, is this: tariffs, particularly broad and untargeted ones, pass the cost of taxation to American households. This rule is simple and unforgiving. When companies have to pay more for imported goods, they'll often pass that cost down to consumers in the form of higher prices. Low- and middle-income households particularly bear the brunt of broad-based tariffs. This demographic tends to use a larger share of their income on consumption and has less financial padding to absorb price increases. Essentials like clothing, appliances, and electronics would become more expensive under widespread tariffs. Furthermore, the existing wealth gap would likely widen if such costs are borne disproportionately by those already struggling with inflation and wage stagnation. A study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that tariffs functionally increase the cost of living for average Americans, with the most significant impact felt in rural and lower-income demographics. By raising prices across the board, tariffs could also reduce overall demand, leading to weaker economic growth. Still, it's worth acknowledging that tariffs could theoretically benefit certain industries by minimizing foreign competition. For example, domestic manufacturers of goods similar to those facing tariffs on imports may gain a price advantage. However, such gains tend to be concentrated in specific sectors, primarily capital-intensive industries, and do not offset the broader economy-wide costs. Moreover, any gains could be eroded if U.S. trading partners impose retaliatory tariffs, as China did during the previous trade war, further isolating the U.S. economy. Yellen's critique of Trump's tariff strategy is particularly focused on how these policies would affect the U.S.-China trade relationship. Although geopolitical tensions have led to calls for decoupling from China, the reality is more complex and nuanced. The repercussions of a full-scale economic and trade decoupling would not only affect the U.S. and China, but would reverberate throughout the global economy. Let's delve deeper into the U.S.-China dynamic, a linchpin issue in the broader debate over tariffs. and explore what it really means for the U.S. economy if Trump's hardline tariff strategy were to return. Since China joined the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001, the country has transformed into the world's largest manufacturing hub, with global supply chains built on its dominant role in producing everything from electronics to textiles to industrial components. The U.S., as the world's largest consumer market, has become deeply linked to this network. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 2023, China ranked as the third-largest trading partner of the U.S., with over $635 billion in goods traded. The U.S. runs a substantial trade deficit with China, importing far more than it exports. While many see this trade imbalance as a problem, it also reflects China's role as a major supplier of cheap goods to the U.S., keeping costs down for American consumers and businesses. The notion that one can simply decouple from China and reduce dependence quickly, without major disruptions, is highly problematic. Trade isn't a zero-sum game, and the economic divorce from China would come at an enormous cost. So what happens if the U.S. suddenly raises tariffs or cuts ties with China more aggressively, as Trump suggests through his tariffs or threats of increased duties? Much like with his earlier tariffs on Chinese exports, any new round of indiscriminate tariff hikes would reverberate through U.S. supply chains and exacerbate inflation for consumers, all while businesses scramble to find suitable alternatives for sourcing materials and goods. Imagine the cost of trying to move the bulk of U.S. consumer supply chains, whether it's iPhones, clothing, or car parts, to other countries. Though some U.S. companies have already diversified away from China, like Apple's ongoing shift of some production to India and Vietnam, this is far from an overnight solution. The restructuring of supply chains is a long, complicated process that requires new infrastructure, skilled labor, and manufacturing capacities, things that don't magically appear. Moreover, it's not only American businesses who rely on China. So too do consumers. Figures from 2023 showed that China remained the top importer to the U.S. of consumer electronics, apparel, toys, and countless other household goods. If a country like Vietnam or Mexico were to emerge as the replacement for China, the so-called China Plus One strategy currently being adopted by many global corporations still doesn't erase the intermediate cost of tariff disruptions. Not to mention, these smaller economies are unlikely to fully replace China's scale, efficiency, and established logistics networks anytime soon. It's important to remember that Yellen distinguished between treating China as a strategic competitor and the broader benefits of economic interaction with Beijing. Her central point: economic competition doesn't necessarily mean total economic isolation. This echoes what many experts recognize, that shutting down trade with China would be economically devastating for both countries and highly disruptive for the global economy. Consider Yellen's 2023 visit to China, where she emphasized the need for the U.S. and China to maintain pragmatic trade relations despite their differences. While Washington has implemented stricter controls on technology exports to China due to security concerns, like semiconductors and AI-related technologies, Yellen advocates for a balanced approach that protects U.S. national security interests without leading to full economic Cold Wars. As she says, trade and investment with China can bring significant gains to American firms and workers and must be maintained. If the U.S. undertakes a massive tariff hike on imports across the board, as Trump suggests, we could very well see a continuation or even escalation of the tit-for-tat tariff retaliation that occurred during Trump's first term in office. U.S. allies could also be caught in the crossfire, further straining relationships with Europe, Canada, Mexico, and others. While Trump's protectionism had been primarily aimed at China, the administration also used tariffs as a bargaining chip with traditional American allies such as the European Union and Canada. For instance, Trump enacted tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, spurring retaliation from the European Union, which slapped tariffs on iconic American products like Harley-Davidson motorcycles and bourbon whiskey. Given the strategic importance of maintaining the U.S.-Europe alliance, particularly in light of shared challenges like opposing Russia's invasion of Ukraine and interconnected energy markets, Yellen rightly points out that such tariffs could have damaging geopolitical implications. A miscalculation with tariffs could make America's allies more hesitant to collaborate on security, energy, and other economic fronts, weakening collective global influence. Mexico, as the U.S.'s second-largest trading partner, after Canada, stands to lose significantly from new tariffs. Touted as a popular nearshoring destination, Mexico's tight coupling with U.S. supply chains means that punitive tariffs on Mexican goods would disrupt industries, particularly ones heavily reliant on cross-border trade like the auto or agriculture sectors. In fact, retaliations from any large U.S. trading partners could target industries that are vital to key American states, intensifying the economic fallout. This puts considerable pressure on U.S. manufacturers, which include many Midwestern and Southern states that are traditionally seen as Trump's stronghold constituencies. Instead of proposing universal tariffs, what the U.S. desperately needs are forward-looking, long-term strategies that guarantee competitiveness in a global market that's shifting fast. While tariffs deliver a headline-grabbing punch and may stoke nationalistic sentiments, they don't address larger structural issues in the U.S. economy. Rather than pursuing a blunt instrument like tariffs, which create immediate disruptions in both trade and consumer prices, the U.S. could benefit from a strategy focused more on its innovation prowess and workforce development. Ensuring America remains a leader in cutting-edge industries such as aerospace, AI, biotechnology, and renewable energy is likely a better path for long-term growth. Consider, for instance, the role of domestic investment in education, research and development, R&D, and infrastructure. Yellen and many mainstream economists have argued that fostering a dynamic and competitive domestic economy requires bolstering innovation and talent rather than resorting to trade barriers. The U.S. currently spends a lower percentage of GDP on R&D compared to countries like South Korea, Israel, and Germany. Meanwhile, countries such as China have been ramping up their R&D investments, aiming to become technological leaders. Innovation and a skilled workforce are also key ingredients in transitioning to cleaner and greener energy economies, which are set to dominate future global trade. Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, includes provisions to support renewable energy industries and domestic manufacturing of electric vehicles. This, rather than punitive tariffs, could be part of the solution to creating sustainable U.S. jobs and industries for the future while reducing foreign dependence. Another key concept that Yellen touched upon was the idea of bolstering domestic social safety nets. One of the reasons foreign competitors like China outmaneuver the U.S. in certain industrial sectors is their strong central planning and ability to pour immense public resources into specific fields. China effectively subsidizes its industries, ensuring they can engage in global trade at favorable terms. By contrast, the U.S. would benefit from creating a safety net that helps workers transition into new sectors as industries shift away from old manufacturing models. This means promoting workforce training programs, unemployment benefits, and healthcare protections that minimize the economic disruptions caused by both globalization and technological innovation. Such economic resilience would reduce the necessity of protectionism, allowing American firms and workers to adapt to rapidly changing global markets. The current debate over tariffs, sparked once again by Donald Trump's return to the political stage, serves as a reminder of the complex interconnectedness of today's economies. Janet Yellen's warnings against sweeping, untargeted tariffs signal a broader understanding that policies which fragment global trade might create harsh, unintended consequences for American households and businesses alike. At the heart of the issue is this simple truth: tariffs, while politically appealing in the short term, tend to function as regressive taxes on consumers and disruptors of global supply chains. The negative spillover from Trump's proposed tariff policies would likely outweigh any targeted benefits, especially when considering ongoing inflation risks, supply chain vulnerabilities, and global economic volatility. Instead, as Yellen and most mainstream economists suggest, the U.S. should pursue a more nuanced and cooperative global economic strategy. Building a stronger domestic economy will require investments in innovation, infrastructure, and education, not broad tariffs that isolate America economically from both its foes and allies. Opportunities lie not in barricading markets, but in making America a hub for cutting-edge industries, sustainable energy, and an agile workforce prepared for the future. America faces a choice. It can either set itself apart through self-imposed tariffs and trade wars, or lead the world with an economy built on innovation, ingenuity, and openness. The path ahead is clear for those willing to look beyond the allure of protectionism and embrace a more sustainable, long-term growth strategy.